The day my sister begged me to save her, she still thought I was the one who lost everything. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and 3 months ago I stood in a quiet conference room on the 27th floor of a downtown Chicago office building while 3 attorneys argued over a $5 million trust that everyone believed belonged to my sister, Chloe Carter, and not a single one of them realized they were all looking at the only person in that room who actually controlled it. I remember the exact moment her voice changed on the phone earlier that morning. No more arrogance, no more laughter. Just panic wrapped in forced composure as she said my name like it physically hurt her to say it. Ethan, I need your help. And for a second I didn't respond because 5 years earlier, she had looked me in the eye across a polished mahogany table and told me I was nothing, that I had no claim, no future, no place in the family we were both born into, and back then she had laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, but confidently, like someone who believed the world had already decided. She was right. I didn't know it then, not fully, not in the way I understand it now, but that moment, that laugh, was built on a mistake so quiet and so technical that it would take years to unravel, and when it finally did, it wouldn't just cost her money, it would cost her certainty. But I'll get to that, because to understand why my sister was calling me after cutting me out of everything, you have to understand what she thought she took from me, and more importantly, what she never actually owned. Growing up, the Carter family wasn't just comfortable, we were structured. Everything had a system, a hierarchy, a logic that no one questioned out loud, and at the center of it all was the trust my grandfather established before he passed, a $5 million family trust designed to support both of his grandchildren equally, at least on paper, because in practice, equality depends on who's interpreting the rules. And in our house, Chloe was always the one people listened to. She was 3 years older, confident in a way that made adults nod before she finished speaking, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the reference point for everyone else, while I was quieter, more analytical, the kind of kid who read documents instead of skimming them, who asked questions people didn't have the patience to answer, and for a long time I thought that difference didn't matter, that eventually results would speak for themselves. That consistency would win over charisma, but I didn't know how decisions were really made in our family. I remember one specific afternoon when I was 16, sitting at the kitchen counter with a stack of papers related to the trust, not because anyone asked me to, but because I was curious, and Chloe walked in, glanced at what I was reading, and smiled in that way she always did when she thought something was beneath her. "You actually read that stuff?" she said, and I shrugged, told her it mattered. Told her it was important to understand how things worked, and she laughed, light and dismissive. "It doesn't matter who reads it, Ethan, it matters who controls it." And at the time, I didn't realize how literal that statement would become. Years later, when our grandfather passed and the trust officially transferred into active management, everything moved quickly. Meetings were scheduled, documents were signed, and Chloe stepped into the center of it all like she had been preparing for that moment her entire life. Speaking confidently to attorneys, guiding conversations, making decisions that everyone else accepted without hesitation, and I stood there, present but peripheral, watching it unfold, telling myself there would be a moment where details mattered more than confidence, but that moment didn't come when I expected it to. Instead, it came disguised as something small, something procedural, something everyone else overlooked. The day Chloe officially took control of the trust was the same day she told me I had no claim left, that my portion had been restructured, that legally and practically everything now flowed through her, and I remember the silence that followed those words, the way the room seemed to settle around her certainty, and then she laughed, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone heard it, and said, "You should have paid more attention, Ethan." And maybe she was right in the way she meant it, but not in the way it actually mattered, because what she didn't know, what no one in that room realized, was that the one section of the trust agreement she never bothered to read closely, the clause buried in language most people skip over, didn't assign power the way she thought it did, and while she walked out of that meeting believing she had taken everything, I walked out knowing something didn't add up, not yet fully understanding what it meant, but knowing enough to start looking deeper. I didn't confront her. I didn't argue. I didn't try to correct the narrative she had already built, because I've learned that timing matters more than being right, and sometimes the strongest position you can take is silence, especially when everyone else is convinced the story is already over. For months, then years, Chloe operated as if the trust was entirely hers, making decisions, moving money, expanding investments, building a version of reality where I simply didn't exist, and from the outside it looked like she had won, like she had taken control exactly the way she said she would, and I let it look that way because every system reveals itself eventually. Every assumption gets tested, and every document, no matter how long or complex, still follows its own rules. And 3 months ago, when her lawyer finally called me into that office on the 27th floor, when the first real complication surfaced, when the numbers stopped aligning with the authority she thought she had, that's when everything she built on that moment of laughter started to shift, and that's when she realized the one thing she never expected, the one thing she never prepared for, was me. I did not rush to that office because panic is loud, and I have learned to listen for quiet details instead, and the quiet detail in Chloe's voice was not fear of losing money, it was fear of losing control, and those are not the same thing. When I walked into that conference room, she was already there, sitting at the far end of the table with her attorney on one side and a financial advisor on the other, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes kept moving to the stack of documents in front of them, like she was trying to solve something that refused to make sense. And for a moment, I saw the version of her that no one else ever saw, not the confident one, not the one who laughed, but the one who realized she might have missed something important. Her attorney stood when I entered, introduced himself formally, and began explaining the situation as if I were just another interested party, using precise language, controlled tone, phrases like irregular authorization patterns and compliance review, and I nodded along, letting him talk because what he was really saying was simple. The bank had flagged transactions that required a level of approval Chloe did not legally possess, and they needed clarification on who actually had that authority. Chloe interrupted him halfway through, her voice sharper now, insisting that she was the primary controller of the trust, that all documentation supported that there must be some error, and the attorney paused, looked down at the papers again, and then said something that shifted the entire room by a fraction. According to the original trust structure, there is an additional layer of authorization that has not been acknowledged, and I watched Chloe's expression tighten just slightly, the way it used to when she was trying to remember something she dismissed too quickly. I knew exactly which clause he was referring to, the one I had gone back to years earlier, the one written in language that looked procedural but carried real weight, the clause that separated operational visibility from actual control. And I remembered the night I first understood it, sitting alone in my apartment with a printed copy of the trust agreement spread across my kitchen table, reading the same paragraph 3 times before it fully clicked, realizing that while Chloe had been named the visible manager, the final authority for certain categories of decisions required a secondary trustee approval, and that trustee was not optional, not symbolic, not replaceable without a formal amendment that had never been executed. I did not say anything then either because understanding a system and using it are two different things, and timing, again, mattered more than reaction. Back in the conference room, Chloe turned to me for the first time since I walked in, her expression controlled but her voice lower now, more careful. "Ethan, do you know what they are talking about?" And for a second I considered answering directly, explaining it clearly, showing her exactly where the oversight happened, but I realized that would give her clarity without consequence, and clarity without consequence changes nothing. Instead, I asked the attorney to continue, and he did, outlining how certain distributions, reallocations, and structural changes required dual authorization, and how recent activity had triggered a review because that second authorization had never been formally documented. The room felt smaller after that, not physically but structurally, like the hierarchy everyone assumed was stable had just shifted into something uncertain, and Chloe leaned back slightly, processing, recalculating, trying to align what she believed with what was being presented. "So who is listed as the secondary trustee?" her advisor asked, and the attorney hesitated just long enough to make it clear that the answer mattered more than the question. Then he turned the document toward the center of the table, his finger resting on a line of text that had been there the entire time, unchanged, unnoticed, and said, "Ethan Carter." I did not react immediately, because I had already lived with that knowledge for years already. Built my understanding around it. already accepted that the system did not need me to announce it to function, but Chloe reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small shift in her posture, a tightening around her eyes, the first visible crack in the certainty she had carried since the day she told me I had nothing. "That does not make sense," she said, more to herself than anyone else. And I could see the exact moment she started replaying the past in her head, the meeting, the documents, the signatures, the assumptions, searching for where this detail could have been missed. And the truth was simple. It was never hidden. It was just never important to her because she believed control came from being seen as in charge, not from the structure that actually defined it. The attorney began explaining the implications, what actions could proceed, what required additional approval, what would need to be reviewed retroactively, and I listened, not because I needed the explanation, but because I wanted to hear how the system described itself now that it was being questioned, and every sentence confirmed the same thing. Chloe had been operating within the appearance of control, but not its full authority, and now that distinction was no longer theoretical, it was actionable. She turned to me again, and this time there was no trace of the laugh I remembered, no dismissal, no certainty. Just a question she did not want to ask, but had no choice left but to say, "What does this mean for me?" And for the first time since I walked into that room, I answered, slowly, clearly, without raising my voice, "It means you never owned it the way you thought you did." Chloe did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said because for the first time in her life, she was not controlling the narrative. She was reacting to it, and that is a very different position to be in. She looked down at the document again, scanning the same lines that had always been there, the same words she had dismissed years ago. And I could almost see the shift happening in real time as confidence gave way to calculation, as certainty turned into doubt, and as doubt slowly became something closer to understanding. "That is not how this was explained to me," she said finally, her voice steady but lower than before, and her attorney responded carefully, choosing each word like it carried weight. "The structure was always there. It simply was not emphasized." And that sentence landed exactly where it needed to, because it exposed the difference between what is written and what is remembered, and Chloe had always relied on being told. She was in control rather than verifying that she actually was. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not out of comfort but out of distance, because this moment did not belong to me anymore. It belonged to the system correcting itself, and I had learned a long time ago that systems do not care about fairness, they care about accuracy. "So what happens now?" Chloe asked, and this time she did not look at me when she spoke. She looked at her attorney, as if the answer might still come from someone else, and he took a breath before responding. "Any action involving distribution or restructuring of the trust requires dual authorization moving forward, and prior actions may need to be reviewed for compliance." And there it was, not dramatic, not emotional, just a procedural reality that quietly dismantled everything she thought she controlled. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, a clause buried in legal language, could carry more power than years of assumption. And I thought back to the night I first noticed it again. The moment I realized that control is not about who speaks the loudest, it is about who holds the final signature. Chloe finally turned back to me, and this time there was no attempt to hide what she was feeling, not fear exactly, but exposure, like someone who had just realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. "Why did you not say anything?" she asked, and it was an honest question. Maybe the first honest question she had ever asked me, and I answered it the same way. I had lived it, because you never asked. The room went quiet again after that, but it was a different kind of silence now, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like something had finally aligned with reality. Her advisor began discussing next steps, options, scenarios, ways to stabilize the situation. And I listened without interrupting because I wanted to see how they would rebuild a structure that had been built on a misunderstanding, and every solution they proposed led back to the same point. My approval was required. Chloe pressed her hands together on the table, thinking, recalculating again, but this time without the same confidence, and I could tell she was running through everything she had done over the past few years, every decision, every transfer, every move she made under the assumption that she was the sole authority, and now each one of those decisions carried a question she could not answer alone. "If we correct this now," she said slowly, "can we move forward without further issues?" And her attorney responded with the same careful tone. With proper authorization, yes. And again the emphasis was subtle but clear. Proper authorization did not mean her signature, it meant ours. I did not feel satisfaction in that moment the way people might expect. There was no sense of revenge, no dramatic shift in emotion, just clarity, the kind that comes when something you understood privately is finally acknowledged publicly. I remembered the day she told me I had nothing, the way she smiled, the way everyone in that room accepted her version of reality without question, and I realized that nothing about that moment had actually changed except one thing. Now the system had spoken for itself. Chloe looked at me one more time, and this time there was no distance between the question and the answer she needed. "Are you going to help fix this?" she asked, and the way she said it mattered. Not demanding, not assuming, but asking, and that was new, because for the first time she was not speaking from control, she was speaking from need. I let a few seconds pass before responding, not to create tension, but to make sure the moment was real, because decisions made too quickly often repeat the same mistakes. And I had no intention of repeating anything from the past. "That depends," I said, and her expression tightened slightly again, waiting for what came next, and I continued, "On whether you understand what actually happened here, because this was never just about money. It was about how easily control can be assumed and how quietly it can be taken back when no one is paying attention. And in that room, on that floor, with those documents spread across that table, my sister was finally seeing something she had never seen before. Not me, not really, but the structure that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice it." Chloe held my gaze for a moment longer, as if she was trying to decide whether this was still a situation she could steer or if she had already lost that ability, and I could see the shift happening again, slower this time, more deliberate, like she was learning in real time that control is not something you declare, it is something you either have or you do not. "I understand enough," she said, but even as she said it, there was a hesitation underneath her words, the kind that comes when someone realizes they missed more than they want to admit, and I did not correct her, because understanding is not proven by words, it is proven by what you do next. Her attorney began outlining a path forward, structured, procedural, a sequence of steps that would bring the trust back into full compliance, but every step had one constant requirement, dual authorization, my authorization, and each time he said it, even indirectly, it landed a little heavier in the room. I watched Chloe listen. This time, really listen, not interrupting, not redirecting, just absorbing, and it reminded me of something I had not seen in her since we were younger, before everything became about appearances, before she learned that confidence could replace verification. So we revised the structure, correct past distributions if needed, and move forward with both trustees aligned. Her advisor summarized, and Chloe nodded slowly, like she was repeating it to herself, trying to make it real. Then she looked at me again, and this time there was something different in her expression, not just urgency, but recognition, like she was finally seeing the full shape of the situation, not just the part she could control. "Ethan, I am asking you to work with me on this," she said, and the way she said work with me instead of help me was not accidental. It was an attempt to hold on to some sense of balance, some version of equality, even if the structure did not fully support that anymore. I let the words sit for a moment, not to create tension, but because I needed to be clear about something that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with what came before them. "You told me I had nothing," I said calmly, not accusing, just stating a fact, and she did not deny it. She did not deflect. She just nodded once, small, controlled, and that mattered more than any explanation she could have given. "You made decisions as if I did not exist," I continued, and again she did not interrupt, because now she could see how that assumption had shaped everything that followed. "So before we talk about fixing anything," I said, "you need to decide if you actually understand what that means." And this time she did not answer right away, because there was no quick response that could simplify it, no confident statement that could bypass the reality she was facing. The room stayed quiet again, but this silence was not uncomfortable. It was necessary, like a pause before something resets. Her attorney cleared his throat lightly, not to interrupt, but to remind both of us that time still moved forward, that decisions still needed to be made. And Chloe finally spoke, slower now, more measured. "I understand that I acted like I had full control when I did not." And she paused, just for a second, then added, And I understand that I need your approval to move forward. And that was the closest thing to clarity she had reached so far. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because recognizing a structure is the first step, not the final one. Then here is what happens next, I said, and I could feel the attention in the room shift again, not because I raised my voice, but because for the first time I was defining the direction instead of observing it. We review everything, I continued. Every transaction, every decision, every change made under the assumption of single control, and I saw a brief flicker of resistance in Chloe's eyes, not disagreement, but discomfort, because reviewing everything meant revisiting every moment she had operated without questioning the system, and we correct what needs to be corrected, I added, and this time she nodded without hesitation, because there was no alternative path that did not lead back to the same requirement. Her advisor began taking notes, her attorney started outlining a timeline, and the room shifted from uncertainty into process, from assumption into structure, and I sat there, watching it happen, not as someone reclaiming something, but as someone who had never actually lost it in the first place. Chloe leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested she was finally accepting the reality in front of her, and for the first time since that phone call, she looked less like someone trying to regain control and more like someone trying to understand it. I should have read it more carefully, she said quietly, almost to herself, and I responded without hesitation. You should have understood it, because reading something and understanding it are not the same thing, and in our case, that difference was worth $5 million. The meeting continued after that. Details, timelines, next steps, all the necessary pieces of rebuilding a system that had been misunderstood for years, but the real shift had already happened, not in the documents, not in the structure, but in the way Chloe looked at me now, not as someone she had already dismissed, but as someone she could not ignore anymore, and that, more than anything else, was the part she never saw coming. The review process did not feel dramatic the way people imagine these situations should. There were no raised voices, no sudden confrontations, just a steady unraveling of assumptions line by line, document by document, and that was what made it real. Over the next 2 weeks we sat in that same office more than once, sometimes for hours, going through every transaction Chloe had authorized over the past 3 years, every transfer, every investment, every structural adjustment she had made believing she had full control, and each time a decision required a second level of approval that was not there, the same quiet conclusion followed. It needed to be corrected, not because anyone wanted to challenge her authority, but because the system did not recognize it the way she believed it did. I watched her change during those meetings, not all at once, not in some obvious way, but gradually, in the way she asked questions, in the way she listened before speaking, in the way she stopped assuming she already knew the answer. There was one moment in particular I remember clearly. We were reviewing a series of distributions she had approved the previous year, a set of decisions that had reshaped part of the trust structure, and her advisor pointed out that without dual authorization those changes could not stand as they were. They needed to be either reproved properly or reversed entirely, and Chloe leaned forward, studying the numbers, her expression focused but different now, less about defending what she had done, and more about understanding what needed to be done next. If we redo this with both signatures, does it hold? She asked, and the attorney nodded, explaining the steps, outlining the process, and she wrote it down not because she did not understand it but because she wanted to be precise this time, and that was new. I did not interrupt. I did not remind her of anything because this part was not about proving her wrong anymore. It was about watching her finally see the system the way it actually worked. But even as things moved forward, even as the structure began to stabilize, there was still something unresolved, something neither of us had addressed directly. And I knew it would surface eventually because systems correct themselves, but people take longer. It happened at the end of one of those meetings after the attorneys had stepped out to prepare revised documents, leaving just the two of us in the room, the same room where everything had shifted, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because we both knew what was coming. Chloe broke the silence first, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Why did you never use this before? And it was not a defensive question, it was not an accusation, it was genuine, like she was trying to understand a decision she could not have imagined making herself. I leaned back slightly, considering how to answer it, because the truth was simple but not easy to explain, because I did not need to. I said, and she frowned slightly, not because she disagreed, but because she was trying to follow the logic. You could have stopped me, she said, and I nodded once. I could have, and I let that sit there for a moment before continuing, but that would not have changed anything, because stopping her in that moment would have only created a different version of the same problem, one where she still believed control came from being told she had it. She looked down at the table, absorbing that, and I could see the realization forming, slow but clear, that the issue had never been about what she was allowed to do. It was about what she understood she was doing. So you just let it happen, she said, and this time there was a trace of something else in her voice, not anger, not regret, but recognition, and I answered without hesitation. I let you believe what you chose to believe, because that was the only way she would ever see the difference between assumption and reality. The door opened again. The attorneys returned. The process continued, but something between us had shifted again. Quieter this time, less about control and more about awareness. Over the following days, the corrections were implemented, signatures aligned, structures adjusted, and gradually the trust returned to a state that matched its actual design, not the version either of us had assumed at different times, but the version that had always existed beneath those assumptions. And when it was done, when everything was finally in place, Chloe asked one more question, not in the meeting, not in front of anyone else, but as we walked out of the building together, something we had not done in years. So what happens now? And I looked at her for a moment before answering, because this was no longer about documents or clauses or signatures. It was about something simpler and more difficult at the same time. Now, I said, we decide what we actually do with it. And for the first time since all of this started, she did not respond right away, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood that this time, the answer actually mattered. We stood outside that building longer than either of us expected. Not because there was more to say about the trust, but because for the first time in years there was nothing structured telling us what to do next. No document, no advisor, no system guiding the conversation. Just two people who had spent years operating under assumptions that no longer held. Chloe looked out at the street, hands loosely folded, and I could tell she was thinking in the same way she had during those meetings. Carefully, deliberately. But this time the question in front of her was not about compliance or authorization, it was about choice. I thought I knew what I was building, she said after a moment, her voice calm but quieter than usual, and I nodded slightly because I understood that feeling, not the specifics of her decisions, but the confidence that comes from believing you understand the structure you are working within. You built something, I said. It just was not what you thought it was. And she let out a small breath, not quite a laugh. Not quite frustration, just an acknowledgement that the difference mattered more than she had realized. We started walking without really deciding to, moving down the block in the direction of the parking garage, and for a while neither of us spoke, not because the conversation was over, but because it had shifted into something that did not need constant words. So, what would you do? She asked eventually, and the question was direct, but not demanding, not like before. It was open, like she was asking for a perspective she had not considered. I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to be clear about what the question actually meant, because there is a difference between asking what someone would do and asking what you should do. With the trust, I said, and she nodded, confirming it, and I thought about it for a moment, not in terms of numbers or strategies, but in terms of structure, because that was what had been missing all along. I would stop treating it like something to control, I said, and start treating it like something to manage. And she glanced at me, slightly confused at first, and I continued. Control assumes you decide everything. Management assumes you understand how everything works, and that distinction hung between us for a second, simple but not easy. She looked ahead again, processing it, and I could see the shift happening again. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. I thought I was managing it, she said, and I shook my head slightly, not to correct her harshly, but to be clear. You were directing it, I said, without understanding the system that supported it. And this time she did not push back. She did not defend the past. She just listened, because now she had seen what happens when that gap becomes visible. We reached the garage entrance and paused there, the conversation naturally slowing again. And for a moment it felt like we were back in a place that was unfamiliar. Not because we had not stood next to each other before, but because we had never stood there without the structure of our roles defining us. "I am not asking you to step back," she said finally, and I could tell that sentence mattered to her, not as a strategy, but as a recognition. "I am asking you to be part of it." And there was no calculation in her tone this time, no attempt to frame it in a way that benefited her more, just a straightforward statement. I considered that for a moment, not because I doubted her intention, but because I knew that intentions are only one part of what determines what happens next. "Being part of it means something different now," I said, and she nodded slowly, understanding that I was not referring to the trust itself, but to everything around it, the decisions, the communication, the way things were handled. "I know," she said, and for the first time I believed that she actually did, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to move forward without repeating the same pattern. We did not finalize anything in that moment. There was no agreement signed, no decision locked in, just a shared understanding that the structure had changed and that we both had to decide what to do with that change. I watched her for a second, longer before turning toward my car, and as I reached for the handle she spoke again. One last question, quieter than the rest. "Why did you come today?" And I paused, because the answer to that was simpler than everything else we had talked about, "Because you finally needed to understand," I said, and then I got in the car and closed the door, leaving her standing there not with answers handed to her, but with something much more difficult, the responsibility to decide what to do now that she knew the truth. For the next few days I did not hear from Chloe, and that silence was different from the silence we had known before. It was not distance, not avoidance, it was processing, the kind that takes time because it is not about reacting, it is about rebuilding how you think. I went back to my routine, work, meetings, the same structure that had always been there for me, but there was a subtle shift in how I moved through it, not because anything had changed externally, but because something that had been unspoken for years had finally been acknowledged. And once something is acknowledged, it cannot go back to being invisible. I did not expect her to call quickly, not this time, because the version of Chloe who would have reacted immediately, who would have tried to regain control through speed or confidence, was the version that had just been challenged, and what remained needed space to adjust. When her name finally appeared on my phone 3 days later, I let it ring once, twice, not as a tactic, just long enough to recognize that this was a continuation, not a new beginning, and then I answered. "I have been reviewing everything," she said without preamble, her tone steady, and I could hear the difference immediately. No edge, no performance, just clarity, and I did not interrupt because I wanted to hear how she framed it. "Not just the documents," she continued, "but the way I handled it." And that mattered more than anything else she could have said, because reviewing numbers is procedural, reviewing your own decisions is something else entirely. And she added after a brief pause, "I was wrong about more than just the structure." And there it was, not an apology exactly, not yet, but an acknowledgement that extended beyond the legal framework into something personal. I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening, not because I needed her to say more, but because I wanted to understand what she had actually realized. "I thought control meant I did not need to question anything," she said, "and I treated you like you did not need to be part of it." And I could hear the weight of that sentence in the way she said it. Not dramatic, not forced, just accurate. "You did," I said simply, not to agree, but to confirm that we were talking about the same thing. There was a brief silence after that, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of pause that happens when both people are aligned on what just changed. "I want to move forward differently," she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear statement of intent, and I believed her, not because of how she said it, but because of what she had already done, the review, the reflection, the time she took before calling. "Then we do," I said, and that was it. No conditions, no extended discussion, because the structure itself already defined what needed to happen, and everything else would be built on top of that. Over the next few weeks, the way we worked together changed in ways that were noticeable but not dramatic. Decisions were discussed before they were made, documents were reviewed from both perspectives, and more importantly, questions were asked, not because they had to be, but because they mattered. There was one meeting in particular that stood out, not because anything unusual happened, but because of how normal it felt. We were sitting across from each other with the same advisors, reviewing a new investment proposal, and instead of presenting a decision, Chloe laid out the structure, the risks, the reasoning, and then paused, not for approval but for input. And that difference, small as it might seem, was the clearest sign that something had actually changed. I offered my perspective. We adjusted the approach. And when we both signed off on it, it was not about authority, it was about alignment. And for the first time, the trust operated the way it was designed to, not as a tool for control, but as a system that required understanding from both sides. Outside of those meetings, the dynamic between us shifted more slowly, not because it was more complicated, but because it was less defined. There were no documents to guide those conversations, no structure to fall back on, just two people learning how to interact without the assumptions that had defined them for years. We did not suddenly become close. That would not have been real, but we became consistent. And consistency is something I have always trusted more than sudden change. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sent me a message, not about the trust, not about any decision, just a simple question about something unrelated. And I realized then that this was the part that mattered most. Not the money, not the structure, but the fact that the conversation itself had changed. I did not know exactly where it would lead, and I did not try to define it too quickly, because I had learned that forcing clarity too soon often creates the same kind of misunderstanding we had just spent weeks correcting. But I did know one thing, something I had understood quietly for years and now saw clearly in front of me. Control is never as important as people think it is, understanding is, and once that shifts, everything else follows, whether you expect it to or not. What surprised me the most was not that things improved, it was how quietly they did. There was no single moment where everything suddenly felt different, no dramatic turning point, just a series of small decisions that started to align in a way they never had before. Weeks turned into a couple of months, and the trust began to operate with a kind of consistency that had been missing, not because the structure changed, but because the way we approached it did, and I could see it in the details. In how Chloe reviewed proposals more carefully, in how she asked questions she would have dismissed before, in how she paused instead of pushing forward just to maintain momentum. One afternoon, we were reviewing a potential real estate investment, a property just outside Dallas. The numbers looked strong on the surface, projected returns, steady growth, everything that would have appealed to the version of Chloe I knew before. But this time she did something different. She stopped halfway through the presentation and asked for the underlying assumptions, not just the summary, not just the conclusion, but the structure behind it. And as the advisor walked through it step by step, I watched her process it, not looking for confirmation but for understanding. And when she finally looked at me, she did not ask if we should approve it. She asked what I saw that she might be missing, and that question alone told me more than any result ever could. We decided to pass on that investment, not because it was bad, but because it did not align with the long-term structure we were building. And as we signed off on that decision together, I realized something I had not expected. I trusted her judgment, not because she was always right, but because she was finally willing to question herself. Outside of those meetings, the changes were less obvious, but just as important. Conversations became more direct, less filtered through assumptions, and there were moments, small ones, where I caught glimpses of something we had not had in years. Not closeness exactly, but clarity. One evening she invited me to dinner, not to discuss the trust, not to review anything, just dinner, and I almost declined out of habit because for a long time anything involving her came with an expectation, a structure, a purpose, but this time there was none, and that absence felt unfamiliar in a way that made me pause. I agreed, and when I got there, the conversation stayed simple at first. Work, routine, neutral ground, but gradually it shifted, not forced, not planned, just naturally. Moving into spaces we had avoided before. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been?" she asked at one point, and I knew exactly what she meant. Not just the trust, but everything around it, the years, the assumptions, the way we had positioned ourselves in relation to each other. "I used to," I said, and she nodded slightly, as if she expected that answer. "And now?" she asked, and I took a moment before responding because the answer had changed over time. "Now I think about what actually is," I said, and that seemed to settle something for her, not resolve it, but place it somewhere she could understand. She did not apologize that night, not directly, not in a way that tied everything together into a single statement, and I did not expect her to, because what had happened between us was not something that could be reduced to one moment or one sentence. It was a pattern, and patterns are not undone by words. They are undone by consistency. As we left the restaurant, there was a brief pause again, the kind that had become familiar, not uncomfortable, just open, and she said something simple. "I am glad you came," And I nodded because even if I had not expected to be, driving home that night, I thought about how easily everything could have gone differently, how a single clause, a single overlooked detail, had shifted the entire balance of what we thought we understood, and how that shift had forced both of us to see something we had avoided for years, not just about the trust, but about each other. And as I pulled into my driveway, I realized that what mattered was not who controlled what, not anymore. It was whether we could continue to build something that actually worked, not on paper, not in theory, but in practice, because that was the part no document could guarantee, and that was the part we were still figuring out. The next shift did not come from a document or a meeting. It came from something much smaller, and because of that, it mattered more. It started with a message from Chloe early one morning, not about a decision, not about an investment, just a single question about a transaction we had both already reviewed, and at first I thought she was double-checking, but when I looked closer at what she was asking, I realized it was not about the transaction itself. It was about the reasoning behind it, the structure beneath it, and that told me something had fully changed, not temporarily, not situationally, but fundamentally. We met later that afternoon, same office, same table, but the energy was different again, less about fixing something and more about building something intentionally, and as we went through the numbers, she stopped midway and said, "Walk me through how you see this long term." And there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just a clear request for perspective. And I answered the way I always had in my own head, outlining how each decision connected to the next, how short-term gains could create long-term constraints if the structure was not balanced, and she listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, just absorbing it fully. "I never thought about it that way," she said when I finished, and I could tell she meant it, not as a reaction but as a realization, and that was the moment I understood that this was no longer about correcting the past. It was about redefining how decisions were made moving forward. But change like that does not stay contained in one area. It expands, and I started to notice it in places that had nothing to do with the trust. Small conversations, quick exchanges, moments where the old pattern would have taken over, and it did not. One evening she called me, not for advice, not for approval, but to tell me about a situation she handled differently, something minor, something that would not have mattered before, and she explained her reasoning step by step, almost like she was testing it out loud. And when she finished, she did not ask if she was right, she just waited, and I told her what I saw, not to validate her, but to add to it, and she nodded. Even though I could not see it, I could hear it in the way she responded, and then she said something that stayed with me. "I think I am finally starting to understand how this actually works," and for the first time, that statement felt accurate. At the same time, something else began to surface, something quieter, less about the present, and more about everything that had led up to it, and it showed up in the way she paused sometimes before speaking, like she was deciding whether to say something she had avoided for years. It happened one afternoon after a meeting. We were gathering our things, the room already half empty, and she said, almost casually, "I used to think you did not care about any of this." And I looked at her for a moment before answering, because that assumption had been there for a long time, shaping how she saw me, how she treated me, how she justified decisions that excluded me. "I cared enough to understand it," I said, and she nodded slowly, like that filled in something she had been missing. "I just never saw it," she admitted, and there was no defense in her tone, no attempt to soften it, just a simple acknowledgement. And I realized then that understanding is not just about systems, it is about people, and how easily both can be misunderstood when you assume instead of observe. The trust continued to grow steadily, not dramatically, not in a way that would attract attention, but in a way that was stable, intentional, aligned, and every decision we made reflected that shift, not because we forced it, but because it had become the default. But even with everything working, there was still one thing neither of us had fully addressed. Not directly, not completely, the moment that started all of it, the meeting, the laugh, the assumption that I had nothing, and I did not bring it up, not because I forgot, but because I knew that if it mattered, it would come up on its own, not as a reaction, but as a realization. And one evening, weeks later, as we were finishing another review, Chloe sat back in her chair, looked at the documents in front of her, and then at me and said, quietly, "I really thought you had nothing." And there was no hesitation, no avoidance, just the truth, exactly as it had been, and I held her gaze for a second before responding, not with anything complicated, not with anything emotional, just something simple, something that had been true from the beginning. I never did. And that was the moment where everything that had been assumed, misunderstood, and corrected finally aligned into something clear, not perfect, not resolved, but real, and from that point on, there was no version of the story where either of us could go back to what we thought we knew before. After she said it, after she admitted that she truly believed I had nothing, something settled between us that had been unresolved for years. Not tension, not conflict, just a clear understanding of how far apart our perspectives had been, and how long that gap had shaped everything we did. I did not respond with anything more than what I had already said because there was nothing to add. The truth does not need elaboration when both people finally see it the same way, and for a few seconds we just sat there, not speaking, not avoiding, just letting that moment exist without trying to reshape it into something easier. Chloe nodded once, slowly, as if she was confirming it to herself, and then she looked back down at the documents in front of her, not to escape the conversation, but to continue it in the only way that made sense now, through action. We should finalize the restructuring plan, she said, her tone steady again, but different from before. Less about control, more about completion, and I agreed because that was the next step, not emotionally, but structurally. Over the next week we completed the final adjustments to the trust, every clause reviewed, every authorization aligned, every detail confirmed, not just once but twice, and when the final set of documents was ready, we sat across from each other one last time in that same conference room, the same table, the same city view behind us, but everything else felt different, not because the room had changed, but because we had. The attorney walked us through the final summary, clear, precise, confirming that the trust was now fully aligned with its original structure, dual trustee authorization in place, compliance restored, and as he finished, he slid the documents toward us. One set for Chloe, one for me, and for a moment neither of us reached for them. It was not hesitation, it was recognition, because this was not just a formality. It was the point where everything that had been assumed, misunderstood, and corrected became official. Chloe picked up her pen first, not quickly, not confidently the way she might have before, but deliberately, like she understood exactly what she was doing now, and she signed her name on the designated line, not as the sole authority, but as one part of a structure that required more than just her. Then she slid the documents toward me, and I picked up my pen, not with any sense of victory, not with any emotion tied to what had happened before, just with clarity, and I signed my name where it had always been meant to be. The attorney collected the documents, reviewed them briefly, and then nodded. "Everything is in order," he said, and just like that, the process was complete, not dramatically, not loudly, just officially. We stood up, gathered our things, and walked out of the room together, the same way we had a few times now, but this time there was a finality to it, not an ending, but a transition. Outside, the city moved the same way it always did, people walking, traffic flowing, nothing about the world had changed, but for us, something had, not in a way that anyone else would see, but in a way that defined how everything would work moving forward. As we reached the elevator, Chloe pressed the button and then turned to me, not with a question, not with uncertainty, but with something simple. "It is done," she said, and I nodded because it was not just the paperwork, not just the structure, but the part of the story that had been unresolved for years. The elevator doors opened, we stepped inside, and as it started moving down, she added one more thing, not looking at me this time, but not avoiding me either. "I would not have understood any of this if you had just told me." And I knew exactly what she meant, because understanding is not something you can transfer, it is something you arrive at. And I responded the only way that made sense. "You had to see it." And she nodded again, quietly. Because now she had. When we reached the lobby, we walked out together, and for a moment we stood there, the same kind of pause we had become familiar with, not empty, not uncertain, just open, and then she said something that closed that chapter without needing anything more. "Thank you," and I looked at her, not searching for anything behind the words, not questioning them, just acknowledging them, and I nodded once before turning toward my car. As I drove away, I thought about how easily everything could have stayed the same, how a single overlooked detail could have remained unnoticed, how assumptions could have continued without being challenged, and how none of this would have happened if the system had not forced a moment of clarity. And as I stopped at a red light, watching the city move around me, I realized that in the end, It was never about who had more, who controlled more, or who won. It was about whether you understood what you were part of, because once you do, everything changes, whether you expect it to or not. After everything was finalized, after the documents were signed and the structure was restored to what it had always been meant to be, I expected things to settle into something predictable, not easy, not perfect, but stable, and in many ways they did. The trust operated smoothly, decisions were aligned, and the system no longer felt like something that needed constant correction. But what I did not expect was how much of the past would continue to surface in small, quiet ways, not as problems, not as conflicts, but as moments that forced both of us to recognize how we had been shaped by everything that came before. It started subtly, in conversations that had nothing to do with the trust. Moments where Chloe would pause before responding, like she was measuring her words against something she had only recently started to understand. And I noticed it because it mirrored something I had done for years, the habit of thinking before speaking, not out of caution but out of clarity. One afternoon we were meeting with a new advisor, someone who had not been part of the earlier process. And as he walked through his recommendations, confident, structured, presenting his conclusions as if they were already decided, I watched Chloe closely because I knew how she would have responded before. She would have agreed quickly, moved forward, treated the presentation as confirmation rather than something to examine. But this time she did something different. She let him finish, thanked him, and then asked a single question. Can you walk us through how you arrived at that? And the way she said it was calm, not challenging, but precise. And as he began to explain, I could see her following the logic step by step, not accepting it, not rejecting it, just understanding it. And when he finished, she looked at me briefly, not for approval but for alignment, and I nodded slightly because I saw the same thing she did. And together we adjusted the proposal in a way that made it stronger, not because we disagreed with him, but because we understood the structure behind it. After the meeting, as we walked out, she said something that stayed with me. I used to think confidence meant I did not need to ask questions, and I responded without hesitation. Confidence means you know which questions matter. And she nodded, not because it was new information, but because it was something she had now experienced for herself. Outside of those professional moments, there were still pieces of the past that surfaced in quieter ways. One evening we were going through old files, not for any specific reason, just organizing, reviewing, and we came across documents from years earlier, records from the time when everything had first shifted, and for a moment neither of us moved, because those papers represented a version of reality that no longer existed, but had defined so much of what followed. Chloe picked one up, glanced at it, and then set it back down carefully, like it carried more weight than the paper itself. I really believed this, she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, just a recognition of how complete that belief had been, and I understood that. Because beliefs, once formed, do not feel like choices, they feel like facts. You were told it was true, I said, and she shook her head slightly, correcting that. I chose to believe it without checking, and that distinction mattered, because it was not about what she had been told, it was about what she had accepted. We did not stay in that moment long, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it had already served its purpose, it had been acknowledged, understood, and there was nothing left to change about it. As we moved forward, the focus stayed on what we were building now, not on what had been misunderstood before, and that shift was what made everything sustainable, not perfect, but consistent. There was one final moment that made it clear how much had changed. It was a small thing, something that would have gone unnoticed before. We were reviewing a routine update, nothing significant, and Chloe reached the end of the report, closed the folder, and then paused. Not because there was a problem, but because she wanted to confirm something. Does this align with how you see it? She asked, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a straightforward check, and I answered just as directly. It does. And that was it. No extended discussion, no need to explain further, just alignment. As simple as. That moment it represented something that had taken years to reach. Not because it was complicated, but because it required a shift in how we both approached everything, not just the trust, but each other. And as I left that day, walking out into the same city, the same movement, the same routine, I realized that what had changed was not visible from the outside. There was no sign, no marker, nothing that would tell anyone else that anything had ever been different, but internally, structurally, everything had shifted, and that shift was not something that could be undone. not because it was permanent, but because it was understood, and once something is truly understood, it does not return to being assumed again. By the time everything settled into place, the trust was no longer the center of what we were navigating. It had become something stable, something predictable, something that worked without needing constant attention, and that stability created space for something else to emerge, something neither of us had planned for because it was not written into any document or defined by any structure. It started with a conversation that did not have a clear purpose, not about numbers, not about decisions, just a simple check-in that extended longer than either of us expected, and as we talked, I realized that for the first time we were not referencing the past to explain the present. We were just speaking in the moment, without needing to justify anything that came before. Chloe noticed it too. I could see it in the way she paused at one point, slightly surprised. "This feels different," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and I nodded because it did, not dramatically, not in a way that erased everything that had happened, but in a way that made it no longer define every interaction. "It is different," I said, and that was enough because neither of us needed to explain why. As time moved forward, that difference became more consistent, not because we forced it, but because it was no longer being interrupted by the patterns that had once dominated everything, and those patterns, once recognized, did not return in the same way, not because they were gone, but because we saw them clearly now. There was a moment a few weeks later that made that clear in a way nothing else had. We were reviewing a proposal that had come through one of our advisors, something straightforward, low risk, the kind of decision that would have been approved quickly in the past. And as we went through it, I noticed something subtle. Chloe was not just reviewing the numbers. She was watching how the recommendation was being presented, the language, the assumptions, the confidence behind it, and when the advisor finished, she asked a question that went beyond the surface. "What are we not seeing here?" And the room shifted slightly, not because the question was difficult, but because it changed the direction of the conversation. It moved it from acceptance to understanding, and as the advisor adjusted, clarified, expanded, I realized that this was no longer about avoiding mistakes. It was about actively seeking clarity, and that shift made everything more precise. After the meeting, as we walked out, she said something quietly, almost to herself. "I used to think not questioning something made it stronger," and I responded without thinking, "Questioning it is what makes it real." And she nodded, not because it was new, but because she had now lived it. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about how different everything felt compared to where we started. Not just the trust, not just the decisions, but the space between them, the way conversations happened, the way assumptions were replaced with understanding, and I realized that what had changed was not just the structure, it was the way we approached everything connected to it. Chloe reached out again a few days later, not about work, not about any decision, just to share something small, something that would not have mattered before, and as we talked, I noticed that there was no hesitation anymore, no need to filter or adjust, just a straightforward exchange, and that simplicity, something so basic, had taken years to reach. "I think I understand now why you never reacted the way I expected you to," she said at one point, and I listened, curious to hear how she framed it. "You were not trying to win anything," she continued. "You were trying to understand it." And I nodded, because that was true, not as a strategy, but as a default. And she let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a realization. I spent years trying to be right instead of trying to see what was actually there, and there was no regret in her voice, just clarity, and that was what made it meaningful. We did not stay on that topic long because it did not need to be analyzed further. It had already been recognized, and recognition, once it happens, does not need to be repeated. As the weeks continued, everything moved forward in a way that felt sustainable, not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded. And that grounding came from something simple. We were no longer operating from assumptions, we were operating from understanding, and that difference, while subtle on the surface, changed everything underneath. There was one final realization that came to me quietly, not in a meeting, not in a conversation, just in a moment of reflection, and it was this: the trust, the money, the structure, all of it had always been secondary, not because it did not matter, but because it only functioned as well as the people managing it understood it, and for a long time, neither of us fully did, just in different ways. Now, that had changed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to create something that worked, not just on paper, but in practice, and that was the part no document could guarantee, the part that had to be built, piece by piece, through decisions, through conversations, through moments that did not seem important until they added up into something that was. And as I looked ahead, not at any specific outcome, not at any particular goal, but just at the path we were on, I realized that for the first time, it was not defined by what had happened before, it was defined by what we understood now, and that was what made it different. In the end, nothing about the outside world looked different. The same office, the same documents, the same steady movement of decisions and numbers, but inside that structure, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Not because it was forced, but because it was understood. Chloe and I no longer operated as two people trying to define control. We operated as two people who understood the system we were part of, and that difference changed everything without needing to announce it. There was no final confrontation, no moment where everything was said all at once. Just a quiet continuation of what we had already built, decision by decision, conversation by conversation, until it became the new normal. One afternoon, months later, we sat across from each other reviewing a routine update, something simple, something that would have taken minutes before, but as we talked through it, there was a pause, not because something was wrong, but because nothing needed to be questioned, everything aligned, and Chloe looked at me with a small, almost unnoticeable shift in her expression, not uncertainty, not hesitation, just recognition, and she said, "This works." And I nodded because it did, not just the trust, not just the structure, but the way we were handling it, the way we were working together. And in that moment, I realized something that had taken years to fully understand. Control was never the point, not really, because control, without understanding, is fragile. It depends on assumptions, on appearances, on things that can change without warning, but understanding is different. It holds even when everything else shifts, because it is built on something real. What happened between us was not about winning or losing, it was about seeing clearly, about recognizing that what you believe is not always what is true, and that the gap between those two things can shape everything if you are not paying attention. For a long time, Chloe believed she had everything and I had nothing, and I let her believe that, not because I agreed, but because I knew that understanding cannot be forced, it has to be reached, and when it finally is, it changes more than any argument ever could. And that is the part that stays with me, not the money, not the trust, not the documents we signed, but the shift that happened when assumption gave way to clarity, when certainty gave way to awareness, because that is something that extends far beyond any single situation. People often think that power comes from having control, from being the one who decides, the one who leads, the one who appears to hold everything together. But real power comes from understanding what you are part of, from seeing the structure beneath the surface, from knowing when to question and when to listen. And more than that, this story is about something even simpler, something easier to overlook, the way we see each other, because it is easy to reduce someone to what we assume about them, to what we think they have or do not have, to the role we assign them without ever really looking closer. And once we do that, we stop seeing them entirely. For years, Chloe did not see me, not really. She saw a version of me that fit her understanding of the situation. And in doing so, she missed something that had been there all along. And I did the same in my own way, by staying silent, by letting that version exist without challenging it. But when that changed, when we both started to see clearly, not just the system, but each other, everything else followed naturally, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, in a way that lasted. And that is what matters. Not the moment when everything shifts, but what happens after, the choices you make once you understand, the way you treat people once you see them fully, because in the end, that is what defines what you build, not just in business, not just in structure, but in every part of life that depends on trust, understanding, and the willingness to see beyond what is easy to assume.